Hello, and welcome to our presentation on early adolescence. First, we'll be discussing an overview of some developmental counseling issues that affect this age cohort. Eating disorders is an important issue to consider because symptoms of anorexia, binging, and bulimia usually appear in early to mid-adolescence. Compared to the prevalence of eating disorders, the amount of effective treatment options are relatively limited. Family therapy is the most effective for adolescents, with inpatient then outpatient treatment for extreme cases. Dieting can become common and relatively harmless continuing through this age group, so it's important to consider if a adolescent has a depressed mood while dieting or negative reasons for dieting, because that may affect their eating behaviors. Family media and peer groups or socialization may also affect an adolescent's eating behaviors, and symptoms are often exacerbated and encouraged through decreased self-esteem and negative mood. Some of the negative impacts of having eating disorders physically could be a lower metabolism and risk for weight gain in the future, and mental symptoms could be depression, anxiety, and lower self-esteem. Another counseling issue to discuss is non-suicidal self-injury, which is the deliberate self-injury of one's own body tissue without suicidal intent. This can be things like scratching, cutting, headbanging, burning, branding, interfering with a healing wound, or self-poisoning. It's more often in females than males, highest rate between 12 and 25 years old, peaking at 16 or 17. There's been an influx in research in the last 2 decades. Some things that have been heavily researched recently and need to be considered by counselors is the better understanding on how to prevent self-injury and also the importance of intervention when necessary. This self-injury can also be referred to as wounding, parasuicide, deliberate self-harm, or self-mutilation. And some possible reasons for self-injurious behaviors were originally considered to be just attention-seeking, but now through research we know that it can be things like an alternative to suicide, expressing displeasure with oneself, to feel in control, to alleviate bad moods, or even to incite enjoyable moods. And finally, we're going to discuss sex risks in pregnancies for early adolescence. It's important to understand this issue because there are very few explicit conversations between parents or older guardians and teens about safe sex practices and the risks involved in unprotected sex. There's a lot of statistics that go into this, but I'm going to give you a quick rundown that between the ages of 15 and 19, about 34% of females do not use contraception the first time, and an even lesser number use it the second, third, fourth time, or in their most recent intercourse. These numbers increase when you consider teen Hispanic females who did not use condoms 53% of the time in their most recent intercourse. This risks things like unintended pregnancy, as well as different STIs and STs that you could get at that age. There's also been strong correlations between alcohol and drug use and increased unprotected sexual activity, so that's also an important conversation to have. In our society, churches, learning institutions, and government all encourage abstinence, and even though there's been a decline in teen pregnancy recently, it's really important to build and maintain an open line of communication, build trust, promote abstinence until early adolescents are mature, but also encourage safe sex practices if the adolescent chooses to engage.
Counseling approaches and theories. Family therapy. While there are various approaches to family therapy, the central principles include the client is connected to living systems, the focus on the present is more important than exploring past experiences, change is best facilitated by working on interactions between family members, as well as broader contexts in which the family and the person live. The family provides context for understanding how individuals function in relationship to others and how they behave. There's a focus on verbal and nonverbal communication patterns. There is a specific type of family therapy AN, which is also known as the Maudsley model, which is also referred to as family-based therapy, and it is most commonly used with adolescents with anorexia nervosa. This is an adaptation of Minuchin's family systems therapy. And one of the main differences is that while in Minuchin's family systems therapy, the therapy is designed to alter disturbed family processes that gave rise to problems in the identified patient, the Maudsley model creates a blame-free environment in which the family system can be incorporated into treatment so that they can then take the learned skills in counseling or from counseling back home once the patient returns home. So this came out of research trials that were conducted in the 1980s and 1990s. And these were led by Ivan Eisler. So in addition to Minuchin's family systems, other influences include feminist ideas and narrative concepts on systemic therapy. As mentioned in one of the studies, there are 3 phases to therapy. And these 3 phases are refeeding the client, in which all members of the family play a role. The parents, their role is to refeed the child and form a united front. The siblings' role is to be supportive of the patient, and then together as a family, they devise team plans for refeeding. The second phase is negotiations for a new pattern of relationships. So this is once the patient begins to show willingness to participate in refeeding and weight gain. That's when other family issues that directly affect the patient's weight gain symptoms are introduced into the family therapy, with the symptoms still central to therapy. So, for example, if there was any kind of deception and that was affecting, how well the patient was able to intake food, that's one of those issues that they would bring in at this point. The third phase is termination, at which the patient achieves healthy weight. And at this point, the focus shifts from the illness to the relationship between family members. At this stage, the therapist would take into account the age of the patients, the themes of increased autonomy, appropriate family boundaries, and this is all done in preparation for them to be able to carry out the learned skills on their own. One of the critiques is that there's a limited amount of research that includes minorities and men. Empirical research surrounding child and adolescent eating disorders is limited, and so there is a greater need for a greater breadth of studies as it pertains to this particular age group. And then the final one is that some of the challenges that the therapist might face include losing concern for an individual client's needs because they're focused on the family unit as a whole. And the other issue that they might face is that the Western notions of the nuclear family unit as a family system versus other cultures that may consider, their extended families a family unit. So aunts, uncles, cousins. Dialectical behavior therapy. So this was originally developed by Marcia M. Linehan to treat chronically suicidal individuals with borderline personality disorder. Some effective uses of this treatment now include substance dependence, depression, PTSD, eating disorders, suicidal behavior, and non-suicidal self-injury, which is what our selected topic was. Generally, this involves 1 year of individual therapy and group skills training. Skills are taught in 4 modules: mindfulness, interpersonal effectiveness, emotional regulation, and distress tolerance. And it includes dialectics, which is the need for acceptance and change simultaneously. There is a validation of the client's perceived experiences, and a need for problem-solving strategies are at the heart of therapy. Now, in 2002, Jill Rothfuss and Alec Miller adapted it for adolescents, and I will give you a second to read a little bit more about that in that next slide. DBTA, or the adolescent adaptation, as it pertains to non-suicidal self-injury, there is research that shows that it has proven to increase therapy retention rates, decrease or completely eliminate NSSI, with significant improvement in psychopathology after the completion of the skills portion of the treatment. According to another study, which was a meta-analysis, they also found that this was one of 2 interventions where initial positive findings have been replicated independently. So, according to another study, there are a variety of inconsistencies, however, with regards to existing research that make it challenging to really adequately measure the effectiveness. One of those is mixing various forms of self harm, insufficient use of standardized self harm outcome measures. Variable lengths and intensities of provided treatment. So some were a couple weeks longer than others. And then the inadequate attention paid to DBT adherence. The third theory is motivational interviewing, which is humanistic, client-centered, psychosocial, modestly directive. It was developed in the 1980s by William R. Miller and Stephen Rolnick. It is effective as a brief intervention, and it was originally designed for problem drinking. It does stress client self-responsibility. It is currently used to treat substance abuse, compulsive gambling, healthy behavior change practices, which most closely is tied to the issue at hand. Underlying assumption is that clients want to be healthy and desire positive change. There are 5 principles to motivational interviewing, and I will give you a second to pause and take a look at that slide. There are also 9 pieces that are included within motivational interviewing. I will go ahead and give you a second to pause and take a look at that slide. So, according to one of the studies I found, motivational interviewing appears to be an effective intervention method in adolescents' behavioral health. And considering the lack of information surrounding this topic with this population, and the fact that MI addresses any resistance, this may be a really good match with this particular population. One of the critiques, or one of the positive critiques, is that because it focuses on the experiencing the world from the client's perspective, this theory effectively incorporates nuances that are found in a culturally diverse population. However, limited studies are focused on adolescent population, so we do need more studies with this age group.
And domains, with an emphasis on group therapy. So first, we're going to talk about the social needs of the early adolescent. Early adolescence is a crucial time of social development. These youths become more detached from their parents and more attached to peers and friends, developing the independence associated with later adolescence. This age is characterized by exploration of and commitment to identity as goals and values. There's a strong need to fit in with peers in order to find belonging. This often characterized by conflict with parents, as the opinions of friends begin to carry more weight than the opinions of parents. Youths this age find peers define their identity. Some experience difficulty finding their place in the social environment. There's a desire often to fit into a preferred or chosen group or clique. And this can cause anxiety and stress and depression if they don't achieve that. Erickson identified role confusion when this personal and social identity is not adequately developed. These friendships help adolescents to find and understand their place in the social context, belongingness. And it's influenced by perceptions of self-worth and self-esteem and body image. Another important part of this early adolescent social development is developing interest in the opposite sex or same-sex romantic relationships. This contributes to a higher concern and awareness of body image, as well as they experience peer pressure to engage in sex or sex risky behaviors. Also want to address the emotional needs of the early adolescent. The early adolescent emotional development continues to be impacted by their emotional development and experiences at earlier stages of development. So those earlier adverse experiences may impair the adolescent's ability to develop healthy friendships and find their place in social settings. Furthermore, early childhood emotions and identity have been either affirmed or repudiated. This again goes back to Erikson. So, unsuccessful development of identity can result in difficulty establishing intimacy, whereas affirmed identity and emotions earlier in life will result in a stronger ability to establish those friendships and a higher self-awareness. And then there's also the desire for the feeling of belongingness that drives behaviors. I wish to belong, and so I modify my behaviors to fit into this group or that group. So looking at group therapy for early adolescents, it's a very ideal, a very applicable technique for this age group, especially and specifically because of their developmental needs for identity and belongingness. So for one reason, is that group therapy is affirming. Youths get to recognize that others like them share their same problems. Group therapy is also non-directive. So adolescents at this age begin, they're developing that egocentrism, that the world revolves around me. My friends are more important to me than my parents, authority figures. This egocentrism often manifests as opposition to authority. So a member-led discussion and breakthroughs that come from adolescents themselves to face their own problems, it's empowering. Then group therapy can address a very wide spectrum of topics pertinent to this age cohort: grief and loss, body image, eating disorders, self-harm, peer pressure, self-esteem, etc. Early adolescents are already developing group identity as a support while becoming more independent from their family. And then early adolescent social and emotional needs and growing social awareness make group therapy ideal. So to touch on group therapy, with the developmental domains, all of the domains we understand tend to overlap and share some influences. There are ways the physical domain influences the cognitive, and ways that the cognitive domain influences the psychosocial or the emotional. But there are some specific ways group therapy can address each domain. As discussed already, group therapy is ideal for early adolescents due to their developmental need for group identity and acceptance. Entrusting adolescents to work out their own solutions in a group setting is empowering and developmentally appropriate for addressing issues like peer pressure, family issues, stress, self-injury, etc. Under the physical domain, the application of group therapy to the physical domain comes in addressing situations like body image, removing the stigma around gender identity or sexual orientation, addressing eating disorders like anorexia and bulimia. Again, these things tie over also to the social and the emotional, but as well, adolescents may also find structured groups an ideal place to discuss sex topics such as expectations and pornography and sexting and high-risk sex behaviors. On the cognitive domain, group therapy among adolescents can also be effective at addressing cognitive domain needs, from something as simple as a study group that focuses on forming good study habits to support groups for learning disabilities like dyslexia and ADHD. Groups can aid adolescents in accepting and understanding their needs and developing skills. Thank you for enjoying my portion of the presentation. The next
So next we're going to be talking about barriers to implementation of the theories previously mentioned, and also counseling this age cohort in general. Two barriers I'd like to discuss is time constraints and perceived absence of problem. So for time constraints, this is a barrier for early adolescents because they lack the resources like time and availability to do therapeutic treatment with school counselors, who are the ones most likely to notice and identify problems within the students. That's why most school counselors do solution-focused, short-term counseling, but there's little time to work with individual students on big therapeutic issues like the ones we previously mentioned. This barrier can be resolved by referring students to counselors outside of school and providing other resources for the students, but it's also important to consider that the students themselves may also have time constraints because they have a commitment to their academic, their extracurricular work, and don't have their autonomy over themselves to get to things like counseling sessions. The other barrier I'd like to discuss is perceived absence of problem. Early adolescents are really heavily influenced by their peer group, the opinions and perceptions of the students around them on a day-to-day basis, and considering they spend a lot of time together, and this is a age group where they're often comparing themselves to each other and checking in with one another on what they're doing or what they're not doing, it's important to consider that they may not view the negative behaviors and issues previously listed as actual issues if other people in their class are also having those issues. They may resist treatment and not even view a problem within the behaviors that they're doing. So, for example, I listed dieting, cutting, having unsafe sex in early adolescence may not be viewed as an issue when other people in their age cohort are participating in the same behavior. Lastly, we'll be discussing cultural considerations. So 3 cultural diversity issues I'd like to discuss are strong ethnic identity, heightened awareness of social status, and diverse cultural backgrounds. Strong ethnic identity is really important to consider among this age cohort because it contributes to high self-esteem within ethnic minority adolescents. Ethnic identity can be things like shared values, traditions, and practices of their cultural group. And it's important to encourage this behavior in early adolescence because it leads to higher self-esteem within those groups that may not feel like they're fitting in as ethnic minorities. Next, we'll discuss a heightened awareness of social status and perception of others. So, as previously mentioned, early adolescents really rely on their peer groups, and they spend a lot of time evaluating not only others but themselves. So, things like racial, cultural, ethnic identities and their sexual orientation will become a big part of what they are discussing and learning about themselves at this time. So, it's really important to consider these things when you are counseling students in this age cohort and look out for how they are considering themselves, whether positively or negatively, about their own identities. Lastly, I'd like to discuss diverse cultural backgrounds. A lot of students who have diverse cultural backgrounds may feel like they have 2 separate identities when they are looking at their identities, as we previously discussed. There's the socially acceptable one that they kind of put on to be at school, doing extracurriculars around their social groups, and the one that they've learned and experienced at home. It's really important to consider for early adolescents that they're at an age where they need support from cultural traditions, family functions, and religious beliefs, and it's important for them to rely on those during challenging situations. Thank you so much for listening to our presentation. Please feel free to pause anytime reviewing our references and leave a comment, question, or concern in the thread if you would like to. Thank you.